At 12 o'clock last night, Lee Walker, who attempted to outrage Miss Molly McCadden last Tuesday morning, was taken from the county jail and hanged to a telegraph pole just north out of the prison. All day, rumors were afloat that with nightfall, an attack would be made upon the jail, and as everyone anticipated that a vigorous resistance would be made, a conflict between the mob and the authorities was feared. At 10 o'clock, Captain O'Haver, Sergeant Horan, and several patron men were on hand, but they could do nothing with the crowd. An attack by the mobs was made on the door in the south wall, and it yielded. Sheriff McLendon and several of his men threw themselves into the breach, but 2 or 3 of the storming shoved by. They were seized by the police, but were not subdued, the officers refraining from using their clubs. The entire mob might at first have been dispersed by 10 policemen who would use their clubs, but the sheriff insisted that no violence be done. The mob got an iron rail and used it as a battering ram against the lobby doors. Sheriff McLendon tried to stop them, and some of the mob knocked him down with a chair. Still, he counseled moderation, and would not order his deputies and the police to disperse the crowd by force. The pacific policy of the sheriff impressed the mob with the idea that the officers were afraid, or at least would do them no harm, and they redoubled their efforts, urged on by a big switchman. At 12 o'clock, the door of the prison was broken in with a rail. As soon as the rapist was brought out of the door, calls were heard for a rope. Then someone shouted, "Burn him!" But there was no time to make a fire. When Walker got into the lobby, a dozen of the men began beating and stabbing him. He was half dragged, half carried to the corner of Front Street and the alley between Sycamore and Mill, and hung to a telephone pole. Walker made a desperate resistance. 2 men entered his cell first and ordered him to come forth. He refused, and they failing to drag him out, others entered. He scratched and bit his assailants, wounding several of them severely with his teeth. The mob retaliated by striking and cutting him with fists and knives. When he reached the steps leading down to the door, he made another stand and was stabbed again and again. By the time he reached the lobby, his power to resist was gone, and he was shoved along through the mob of yelling, cursing men and boys who beat, spat upon, and slashed the wretch-like demon. One of the leaders of the mob fell, and the crowd walked ruthlessly over him. He was badly hurt, a jawbone fractured and internal injuries inflicted. After the lynching, friends took charge of him. The mob proceeded north on Front Street with the victim, stopping at Sycamore Street to get a rope from a grocery. "Take him to the iron bridge on Main Street," yelled several men. The men who had hold of the Negro were in a hurry to finish the job, however, and when they reached the telephone pole at the corner of Front Street and the first alley north of Sycamore, they stopped. A hastily improvised noose was slipped over the Negro's head, and several young men mounted a pile of lumber near the pole and threw the rope over one of the iron stepping pins. The Negro was lifted up until his feet were 3 feet above the ground. The rope was made taut, and a corpse dangled in midair. A big fellow who helped lead the mob pulled the Negro's legs until his neck cracked. The wretch's clothes had been torn off, and as he swung, The man who pulled his legs mutilated the corpse. 1 or 2 knife cuts, more or less, made little difference in the appearance of the dead rapist, however, for before the rope was around his neck, his skin was cut almost to ribbons. 1 pistol shot was fired while the corpse was hanging. A dozen voices protested against the use of firearms, and there was no more shooting. The body was permitted to hang for half an hour. Then it was cut down, and the rope divided among those who lingered around the scene of the tragedy. Then it was suggested that the corpse be burned, and it was done. The entire performance, from the assault on the jail to the burning of the dead Negro, was witnessed by a score or so of policemen and as many deputy sheriffs, but not a hand was lifted to stop the proceedings after the jail door yielded. As the body hung to the telephone pole, blood streaming down from the knife wounds in his neck, his hips, and lower part of his legs also slashed with knives, the crowd hurled expletives at him, swung the body so that it was dashed against the pole. And so far from the ghastly sight proving trying to the nerves, the crowd looked on with complacence, if not with real pleasure. The Negro died hard. The neck was not broken, as the body was drawn up without being given a fall, and death came by strangulation. For fully 10 minutes after he was strung up, the chest heaved occasionally, and there were convulsive movements of the limbs. Finally, he was pronounced dead, and a few minutes later Detective Richardson climbed on a pile of staves and cut the rope. The body fell in a ghastly heap, and the crowd laughed at the sound, and crowded around the prostrate body, a few kicking the inanimate carcass. Detective Richardson, who was also a deputy coroner, then proceeded to impanel the following jury of inquest: J.S. Moody, A.C. Waldron, B.J. Childs, J.N. House, Nelson Bills, T.L. Smith, and A. Newhouse. After viewing the body, the inquest was adjourned, without any testimony being taken until 9 o'clock this morning. The jury will meet at the coroner's house, 51 Beale Street, upstairs, and decide on the verdict. If no witnesses are forthcoming, the jury will be able to arrive at a verdict just the same, as all members of it saw the lynching. Then someone raised the cry of, "Burn him!" It was quickly taken up and soon resounded from 100 throats. Detective Richardson, for a long time, single-handed, stood the crowd off. He talked and begged the men not to bring disgrace on the city by burning the body, arguing that all the vengeance possible had been wrought. While this was going on, a small crowd was busy starting a fire in the middle of the street. The material was handy. Some bundle of staves were taken from the adjoining lumber yard for kindling. Heavier wood was obtained from the same source, and coal oil from a neighboring grocery. Then the cries of burn him," were redoubled. Half a dozen men seized the naked body. The crowd cheered. They marched to the fire, and giving the body a swing, it was landed in the middle of the fire. There was a cry for more wood, and as the fire had begun to die owing to the long delay, willing hands procured the wood, and it was piled up on the Negro, almost for a time obscuring him from view. The head was in plain view, as also were the limbs and one arm which stood out high above the body. The elbow crooked, held in that position by a stick of wood. In a few moments the hands began to swell. Then came great blisters over all the exposed parts of the body. Then in places the flesh was burned away and the bones began to show through. It was a horrible sight, one which perhaps none there had ever witnessed before. It proved too much for a large part of the crowd, and the majority of the mob left very shortly after the burning began. But a number stayed, and were not a bit set back by the sight of a human body being burned to ashes. 2 or 3 white women, accompanied by their escorts, pushed to the front to obtain an unobstructed view, and looked on with astonishing coolness and nonchalance. One man and woman brought a little girl not over 12 years old, apparently their daughter, to view a scene which was calculated to drive sleep from the child's eyes for many days, if not to produce a permanent injury to her nervous system. The comments of the crowd were varied. Some remarked on the efficacy of this style of cure for rapists. Others rejoiced that men's wives and daughters were now safe from this wretch. Some laughed as the flesh cracked and blistered, and while a large number pronounced the burning of a dead body as a useless episode, not in all that throng was a word of sympathy heard for the wretch himself. The rope that was used to hang the Negro, and also that which was used to lead him from the jail, were eagerly sought by relic hunters. They almost fought for a chance to cut off a piece of rope, and in an incredibly short time both ropes had disappeared and were scattered in the pockets of the crowd in sections of 1 inch to 6 inches long. Others of the relic hunters remained until the ashes cooled to obtain such ghastly relics as the teeth, nails, and bits of charred skin of the immolated victim of his own lust. After burning the body, the mob tied a rope around the charred trunk and dragged it down Main Street to the courthouse, where it was hanged to a center pole. The rope broke and the corpse dropped with a thud, but it was again hoisted, the charred legs barely touching the ground. The teeth were knocked out and the fingernails cut off as souvenirs. The crowd made so much noise that the police interfered. Undertaker Walsh was telephoned for, who took charge of the body and carried it to his establishment, where we prepared for burial in the Potter's Field today.